بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Today I'm going to talk about something really serious, which is taken without people even noticing. Governments take away your money without you feeling it. How is it that the government take money from you? Usually governments needs money, and they take it from either the taxpayers or they take it from debt. They borrow money. They sell you bonds, and of 1 year or 5 years or 10 years or 30 years, whatever, and they give you interest on it, and they give you the money back after the period finished. But what happened now? Money are actually spent by the government on goods and services and on unemployment. They give wages to people unemployed. Obviously, goods and services including education, defense, social care, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. Now, what happened now that when there is a lot of expenses, like you have wars sometime, you get wars and you get coronavirus, and they start giving people wages and they start spending on research and whatever, and sometimes government mismanage either the tax collection or mismanage the expenditure, and they can become like in debt, and the debt multiply and increase day by day. Usually, according to Islam, the rich give the poor money. Rich give the government tax. Many rich are able to escape giving tax by all sorts of ways, or they move their money to another country and they don't give tax, or they live in an island or somewhere. So the government will need to do something about it to reduce their expenditure, so they live according to what they get from tax and also get from interest rate. They lend money. They obviously lend money they didn't have, but the government guarantee paying back. Or they cut the expenses, and they can't get the rich to give the poor. So that's something is difficult for the government. So they end by printing their own money and they give it to people. Now, cutting spending, nobody likes it, and government usually lose seats when they cut expenditure. They call it austerity. Also, they might cut the budget. They try, instead of paying over 1 year, to pay over 5 years or 10 years, to try to reschedule their debt. Or they try to encourage the rich to give the poor, try to raise tax. If they raise tax also, they will lose seats. They will not be elected. So when they go and print money, they print money so they could have money to carry on spending. They reduced the interest rate to zero, but that didn't help. And the companies cannot pay interest because they have heavy debts. The government have a lot of debt, they can't pay interest. So interest rate went to zero and is not able to help anymore. Some went to minus, negative interest rate. And they tend to print money. All the countries print money. And when they dropped the interest, they dropped it twice before the Second World War and in the 2008 collapse of the market, and that did not help to stimulate the economy. So the government need money, couldn't raise tax, couldn't cut expenditure, couldn't force the rich to give, So they aimed it to printing money, called it quantitative easing. If money was gold, there is limited amount of gold. Governments cannot manufacture gold. The whole gold in the world in 2011 will fill a football stadium. And if you divide it between the human being at that time, it will be each one will have 5 rings of gold per person. So the amount is not enough to use as money. So they try to convince people, forget the gold, use the pound and dollar and euro and yen and yuan and whatever, Swiss franc. And in 2019, the amount of gold is actually they mined more gold. There's now 197,000 tons of gold. Most of it is actually jewelry, and there's private investments, and there's official holding, and there's others. We don't know where the gold is, but there is increased amount of gold, but they still don't want to use gold because they can't manufacture gold. They abandon gold. They can't print money, print a banknote, and they're using the banknotes. And each year, although they mine 2,500 to 3,000 tons, is not enough to move around. So they pretend also it's difficult to carry it from place to place and prone to stealing, whatever. So they convince people not to use gold, and they use their own printed money. But gold they can't manufacture. They cannot increase the amount of gold they have. They have to steal it from another country. They have to confiscate it from people. But they can't use it as a money because they will not be able to make gold. They cannot print gold. They cannot manufacture gold. Gold has to be mined. So they go back always and print more money. And they borrow money from people. The debts in that's in the 14th of May 2020, the US government borrowed 25 trillion 166 billion dollars plus this little bit. And they keep borrowing every single day. If you go to the live debt clock, which is on the internet, it's called US debt clock. Today, just now, they borrowed the 26. They increased by nearly 1.6 trillion debt. So they are borrowing money. Mind you, now they don't pay interest. Interest is 0.025, near zero. So they're borrowing money without paying you any interest, and they increase the pool of money. So there's more money in the market and more money around. The value of the money drops. So what happened now? They print money. The American government printed so much money in 1933, and they again print money in 2008. But 2008 they started printing in trillions, and now they printed after the pandemic 7 trillion. From 2008 until 2019, they print 4 trillion. From March 2020 to now, September 2020, they printed another 7 trillion. And every country actually prints their own money. It's like here, England printed their own money, and Europe. Now, England printed 2 trillion after the pandemic from March 2020 till now. And Europe printed 4 trillion euros from March till now. And Canada printed, and Australia printed, and all the countries print. Some countries managed to keep the value of the money relatively safe, but some countries lose control and the value of the money drops so massively. Like the dollar used to buy 1,500 Lebanese lira, now it buys around 12,000 Lebanese lira. And the same, the dollar used to buy 49 or 50 Syrian pounds, now it buys 2,000 Syrian pounds, because they're printing too much money and they cannot, they don't have the ability to keep the value because they are not part of the international reserve. the value of all the money drops if you compare it with the value of the gold. The gold, the ounce was $35 in $20 in 1913. It's nearly $2,000 now. It's hover around 1900 to 2050, 70. So the dollar now worth 1 cent in 1913, or the dollar in 1913 now is $1,000 now. The value of the dollar dropped from $1 to 1 cent. That's the dollar. What about the Asian money? What about the Middle East money? Obviously far much less. So when you look into the central bank, what they do, they print the money and they go and buy stocks with it, and they buy the bonds, which they originally borrowed the money and gave them bonds. Now they take the bonds and give them money. So they increase the money in circulation, and also they buy the company bonds as well to keep companies functioning. So they buy their bonds, so provide them with liquidity, and they buy mortgage-backed securities, and during the pandemic they gave furlough. They gave 80% of wages of people who were locked down, and in America $600 a week to each person, and they gave some 25 million money weekly, but all of it money printed digitally or on paper, mostly digitally. Every $50 trillion, there's only 3 trillion paper money or plastic money now. Now the central bank brings the money and they buy the bonds and the securities, and the money returned to the governments, and the government give for services and goods and wages and social securities and education, health, and whatever, now to fund the furlough. So they get the money printed by the central banks. And this is what's happening now during the pandemic. They have been giving so much money furlough, but now from October, when the furlough stops, then they will have more unemployed. And the same in America, they have 25 million unemployed. You have to give them an employment benefit to survive. So the value of the money drops, and we can't buy much with it. So people start getting annoyed and frustrated, and they start going on civil unrest and internal fights and strikes and revolutions and things, and that could lead to the army intervening, and will be a lot like civil war in many countries, and it's expected to happen, unfortunately, because the value of money drop and drop and drop, that people cannot buy anything with the money, become like waste paper. The value of the money is less than the paper printed on it. America don't have problem with the debt because they can always print money. So if you listen to Alan Greenspan, who was the Federal Reserve chairman for nearly 12 years, I think, he said America will never default on its debt because it can always print money. And because I have 60% of the international reserves, their money is scattered everywhere. So they benefit from the printed money, while people who hold the dollar outside the United States, they will benefit nothing. So
Chairman Greenspan, the markets tomorrow, how are they going to view this downgrade of America's credit rating?
It's difficult to say, but the only test we have at the moment is the Israeli market, which is open today, and it is tanked. The problem I have with that, however, is there are riots not riots, I say, real significant protests within Israel at the moment, so I can't tell whether one is the other. But considering the momentum in which the market went down over the last week, it is very unlikely, if history is any guide, that this isn't going to take a while to bottom out. So the initial reaction, in my judgment, is going to be negative.
Are U.S. Treasury bonds still safe to invest in?
Very much so. I think this is not an issue of credit rating. The United States can pay Any debt it has, because we can always print money to do that. So there is zero probability of default. What I think the S&P thing did was to hit a nerve, that there's something basically bad going on, and it's hit the self-esteem of the United States, the psyche, and it's having a much profounder effect than I conceived could happen, because the economics of what they're talking about is very clear, and you cannot see any way in which we can go, as we were on Friday, for a vast movement of international funds into the dollar at very low interest rates and then turn on a dime. That is not going to happen, and so that this is not the issue that they make it.
So what happened now in the past, when people who lend money to America and they have the bonds, and America prints a lot of money and the value of the dollar drops, sooner or later people will bring back their bonds and throw it to them and say, give us our gold back, or we don't want your bonds, and the dollar will drop even further and probably collapse. I've written an article which was printed in the Solihull newspaper, tackling just this issue. I've printed it also on Facebook if you want to have a look. And what happened in the Second World War, the German owned world a lot of money, America and Britain and the West, the winners, and they couldn't pay the money after the First World War, so they started a war, the Second World War, to confiscate the goods from countries, because they tried to print mark and the mark went into extreme collapse. The super inflation became hyperinflation, and the value of the market dropped to near zero. So this is unfortunately what's going to happen to the dollar, the pound, the euro, unless people move out of the note money, the paper note money or banknote money. The value of the money will drop. So what do you do if you have the wealth? You need to move out of the paper money. So that's what will happen to you. So what's the way out of the paper money? Is to go to something which retain its value, like gold or silver or platinum or palladium, or just buy stuff with it, or lands or property, or shares goes up, but not safe in one way. On another way, it doesn't compete with gold, and the value of the shares is actually it depends on a lot of factors and international economy, war, and things like this. So make your research and decide how to avoid losing the value of your money and keep yourself safe for the future, because the value of your wage will drop also. So you need to make arrangement with your boss that your wage should increase by the rate of inflation and the GDP, the increased wealth of the country, so you keep being afloat. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.